In early 1944, the strategic situation in the southwestern Pacific had shifted. Months of Allied advances along the northern coast of New Guinea, spearheaded by coordinated land, sea, and air operations, had gradually reduced the operational radius of the Japanese 18th Army and its supporting naval forces. The long campaign from Buna through Lae, Salamaua, Finschhafen, and the Huon Peninsula had forced Japanese forces to withdraw westward, regrouping around remaining strongholds. Among those positions, the island of Biak, located off the northwestern coast of New Guinea in the Schouten Islands, held particular relevance. Its geography included limestone ridges, dense coastal vegetation, and a system of coral caves. These natural formations shaped both defensive possibilities and the potential difficulty of any future assault. By early 1944, Japanese military planners faced a challenge in maintaining their defensive perimeter across the Pacific. Losses in the Solomon Islands, the Bismarck Archipelago, and the Central Pacific had reduced their ability to mount counteroffensives. Resources in fuel, shipping, and trained air crews had decreased significantly. Nevertheless, the Japanese Second Area Army and Naval Air Units continued to regard Western New Guinea as a barrier protecting the approaches to the Philippines and the Central Island groups. Airfields on Biak, still under construction in early 1944, were designed to accommodate long-range aircraft capable of supporting operations across the region. These airfields, particularly the one at Mokmer, represented strategic nodes in the broader Japanese defensive network. For the Allies, particularly the forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, the concept of bypassing fortified Japanese positions in favor of capturing strategically valuable locations with airfield potential became a central operational pattern. This approach, sometimes referred to as a movement of successive leapfrogs along the New Guinea coastline, aimed to shorten supply routes while extending air power forward. By avoiding certain heavily fortified positions and isolating them, rather than capturing them directly, Allied planners sought to economize manpower while accelerating operational momentum. In this context, the planned seizure of Biak was integrated into Operation Reckless, a phase of broader efforts intended to support future operations toward the Vogelkop Peninsula and eventually the Philippines. Intelligence assessments made by Allied headquarters in early 1944 indicated moderate Japanese troop strength on Biak, though estimates varied. Reports suggested elements of the Japanese 222nd Infantry Regiment and supporting units of the 36th Division were present, totaling approximately 4,000 to 5,000 personnel. However, these assessments did not fully account for reinforcements that had begun to arrive and did not reflect the detailed defensive preparations underway. Japanese engineers and infantry units constructed bunker systems, cave-based firing positions, and interlocking kill zones across strategic approaches to the prospective landing beaches and inland pathways. The intention of these defensive positions was to disrupt any invading force's ability to establish airfields or push inland quickly. While strategic motivations shaped high-level planning, the conditions experienced by personnel on both sides were influenced by logistical limitations, disease environments, and geographic isolation. Japanese garrisons across New Guinea faced shortages in medical supplies, food, and aviation fuel, resulting in conditions where resupply was dependent on irregular surface convoys increasingly exposed to Allied air interdiction. Allied units, in contrast, benefited from larger logistical capacity, but they operated in regions where malaria, dengue fever, and heat-related illnesses remained persistent concerns. Medical battalions, preventive protocols, and insect control measures had reduced disease non-combat losses compared to earlier phases of the campaign, yet the operational environment continued to impose strain. Civilian populations on and near Biak, although relatively small and consisting largely of indigenous Papuan communities, were also affected. The island's inhabitants had limited direct involvement in the military planning of either side, but experienced the consequences of military occupation, including resource requisitioning and the disruption of local economic patterns. Some individuals were relocated during the construction of defensive works, while others navigated conditions of uncertainty, seeking to avoid involvement in the conflict. In the months preceding the operation, naval and air forces played a role in shaping the operational environment around Biak. Allied reconnaissance aircraft photographed the airfield construction in progress and defensive placements. Submarine patrols observed shipping movements. Japanese naval air units stationed across the Netherlands, East Indies, and Western New Guinea attempted to defend supply routes and maintain surveillance, but they faced increasingly capable Allied fighter escort operations from bases in eastern New Guinea. By late April 1944, planning for the capture of Biak had reached a stage where timetables and unit assignments were finalized. The campaign would involve ground forces from the U.S. Army's 41st Infantry Division, supported by amphibious landing craft, naval bombardment groups, and tactical aircraft. The objective was not only to capture the island, but to bring its airfields into operational condition rapidly, allowing heavy bomber units to operate closer to the Philippines corridor. For the Japanese command, Biak formed part of a defensive line intended to protect access routes to the western Pacific interior. The contrasting strategies reflected differing assessments of time, mobility, and available material strength, setting the conditions for the engagement that would follow. As planning transitioned to execution in May 1944, the opening phase of Operation Reckless began with coordinated naval, air, and ground movements toward Biak. The U.S. 41st Infantry Division, under the command of Major General Horace H. Fuller, was designated as the primary assault force. It consisted of 3 infantry regiments, the 162nd, 163rd, and 186th, supported by artillery battalions, engineer units, medical detachments, and specialized amphibious teams. The landing force also incorporated armored support elements equipped with M4 Sherman tanks, amphibious tractors, and bulldozers intended to facilitate movement once ashore. These units assembled at staging points in Hollandia and Etape, where final rehearsals and equipment checks were conducted. Command and control for the overall operation fell under General MacArthur's Southwest Pacific Area headquarters, while the naval task forces supporting the landing were led by Rear Admiral Daniel E. Barbie. Task Group 77.2 and associated escort elements included destroyers, transports, landing ships, minesweepers, and supply vessels. Carrier-based aviation was limited in this operation, as Allied planners relied primarily on land-based air units from the 5th Air Force to provide coverage. These air units had been conducting systematic attacks on Japanese air installations in western New Guinea since April. Their objective was to reduce the ability of Japanese aircraft to challenge the landings or disrupt the subsequent consolidation of the beachhead. On the Japanese side, command of Biak's defenses rested with Colonel Naoyuki Kuzume of the 222nd Infantry Regiment, operating under the 2nd Area Army and the Southwest Area Fleet. The defensive plan differed from earlier Japanese strategies observed in the New Guinea campaign. Instead of contesting the landings directly at the shoreline, the Japanese command intended to draw invading forces inland into prepared kill zones built around ridges, caves, and elevated firing positions. The largest of these defensive concentrations was located around the Mokmer airfield plateau. Japanese artillery and machine gun emplacements were positioned to cover expected avenues of advance, while inland cave systems contained both garrisons and supplies intended to sustain prolonged resistance. Initial estimates by Allied planners suggested that Japanese resistance during the landing phase might be limited, based on reconnaissance that indicated relatively quiet coastal positions. However, the interpretation of Japanese defensive patterns was incomplete. The Japanese strategy of depth-based defense and withdrawal from immediate coastal confrontation was partly rooted in lessons taken from earlier battles, including those at Tarawa and Cape Gloucester, where attempts to defend beaches had led to high casualties. At Biak, Japanese forces aimed to force an extended ground battle, slowing the Allied advance and preserving the airfields for as long as possible. The first phase of the operation included preparatory naval bombardment and aerial strikes intended to neutralize defensive positions along the planned landing beaches on the southern coast of Biak, near Bosnek. Minesweepers worked ahead of the amphibious convoy to clear potential hazards. Meanwhile, transport ships maneuvered into position to unload infantry and equipment. Communications between ground, naval, and air commands relied on radio relay, prearranged signal tables, and liaison officers embedded across task units. At dawn, on May 27, 1944, as the amphibious convoys approached Biak's shoreline, meteorological conditions played a role in shaping operations. Sea states were moderate, allowing landing craft to proceed without significant delay. Visibility was sufficient for naval gunfire support to identify designated bombardment coordinates. Aircraft from the 5th Air Force conducted low-level strikes along suspected defensive corridors. The landing beaches themselves consisted of narrow strips of sand bordered by coral shelves and dense vegetation that limited maneuvering room once troops were ashore. Japanese forces near the landing zone maintained limited forward presence, observing and reporting movements rather than engaging immediately. This absence of immediate resistance created an initial impression among some Allied units that defenses were lighter than anticipated. Troops of the 162nd and 186th Infantry Regiments moved inland to establish a provisional perimeter and locate routes toward the airfields. Engineer units began clearing beach obstacles and preparing landing sites for additional waves of supply and equipment. However, as the first day progressed, Allied reconnaissance patrols encountered increasing fire from concealed Japanese positions located along the approaches to the Mokmer Plateau. Machine gun bursts, mortar rounds, and rifle fire emerged from cave complexes and coral ridges rather than from prepared trenches or bunkers near the shoreline. This confirmed the Japanese defensive approach and required adjustments in maneuver planning. Instead of a rapid advance to secure the airfields, Allied units now faced the need to clear elevated terrain under conditions of limited visibility, narrow movement corridors, and unfamiliar geological formations. By evening of May 27th, the beachhead was secured but not fully consolidated. Supplies and reinforcements continued to land, while Japanese units repositioned to counter the Allied progression. The opening phase of the operation had achieved its immediate objective of gaining a foothold on Biak, yet the character of the forthcoming battle had become clearer. It would not be defined by rapid movement across open terrain, but rather by a systematic engagement through defensive networks constructed to prolong resistance and impose attrition. In the months leading up to the assault on Biak, both Allied and Japanese high commands articulated strategic goals that shaped the planning and execution of the operation. For the Allies, Biak's significance primarily rested in its airfields. The Mokmer, Borokoe, and Cerrito airstrips, though not fully operational in late May 1944, were intended to serve as bases capable of supporting medium and heavy bomber groups. Their location, approximately 1,200 kilometers from the southern Philippines, provided a forward platform from which future operations against the Philippine archipelago could be launched. Establishing a continuous chain of air power across northern New Guinea was viewed as essential to maintain the initiative and accelerate the advance without pausing for lengthy logistical consolidation. Allied planning emphasized speed, aiming to secure Biak before the Japanese could reinforce it substantially. The operational schedule was linked to broader campaign timetables, including concurrent operations in Viakde, Hollandia, and the Admiralty Islands. Delays at Biak risked affecting these linked operations and the overall timing of the projected return to the Philippines. Therefore, the plan prioritized rapid seizure of the airfields, followed by immediate engineering work to bring them into operational service. U.S. Army engineer battalions, construction units, and aviation engineers were assigned to follow closely behind the assault forces to initiate runway repairs, construct dispersal shelters, and install necessary logistical infrastructure. In contrast, the Japanese strategic objective centered on denying Allied forces the opportunity to use Biak as a forward air base. The island formed part of a defensive perimeter intended to shield the Netherlands East Indies and the Central Pacific approaches. Japanese planners assessed that even if Biak could not be held indefinitely, delaying its capture would be advantageous. A prolonged defense would force the Allies to expend time, personnel, and equipment, potentially slowing the broader advance. The Japanese command also anticipated that holding Biak might allow time for reinforcement or counterattack by naval air elements operating from the Philippines and the Western Pacific. The defensive plan developed by Colonel Kuzume reflected this emphasis on delay and attrition rather than decisive confrontation. The Japanese garrison, eventually totaling around 11,000 personnel, including infantry, naval troops, engineers, and supporting units, was instructed to rely on terrain advantages rather than attempting to prevent the landings directly. Caves, coral formations, and ridgelines were reinforced with concealed firing positions, interlocking fields of fire, and planned fallback points. Supplies of ammunition, food, and water were stored deep within cave systems to protect them from aerial bombardment. These preparations were intended to sustain extended resistance even if surface positions were lost. Japanese military doctrine had been shaped by earlier engagements where attempts to defend beaches had resulted in high casualties with limited strategic benefit. In response, defense in depth became a revised operational model in parts of the Pacific by 1944. The coral cave complexes of Biak provided an opportunity to apply this approach. Observers from Japanese engineering units had surveyed these formations in advance, identifying positions capable of supporting both direct and indirect fire. Artillery was placed in locations that allowed enfilading fire along expected Allied advance routes, while mortars could be moved between concealed firing positions to avoid counter-battery responses. Allied intelligence assessments, however, underestimated both the size of the Japanese garrison and the sophistication of these defensive preparations. Photographic reconnaissance from the 5th Air Force had identified the airfields and some above-ground structures, but cave systems and underground supply caches were largely undetected. Reports arriving at Allied headquarters suggested a garrison size of approximately 4,000 to 5,000 troops, with limited heavy equipment. This misinterpretation affected the planning of troop distributions. The initial Allied expectation was that the main challenge would be securing the airfields rather than prolonged infantry combat in complex terrain. Logistics played a central role in Allied planning. Amphibious cargo ships and landing craft were organized to deliver not only infantry, but also fuel, ammunition, medical equipment, and engineering tools. Supply lines extended from bases in Hollandia and Etape, supported by naval escorts to prevent interdiction. Air transport capable of delivering spare parts and rapid replacement personnel was positioned to operate once the airfields became usable. The Allies possessed a significant advantage in logistical capacity, yet the environment of Biak, limited freshwater sources, coral ridges, and narrow movement corridors remained a constraint requiring improvisation and adaptation. The Japanese garrison's logistical circumstances differed markedly. Supply routes to Biak depended on surface convoys moving through waters increasingly patrolled by Allied submarines and aircraft. Fuel shortages constrained both aircraft operations and naval mobility. Reinforcement decisions were forced to account for limited shipping availability and the growing risk of convoy interception. These constraints shaped Japanese planning, contributing to the emphasis on defensive endurance within fortified terrain, rather than attempts to engage in maneuver-based or counter-offensive operations early in the battle. The planning phase thus reflected contrasting strategic approaches: a time-sensitive Allied effort to expand forward air power capability, and a Japanese strategy designed to delay and disrupt that advance through protracted defense. These divergent goals, shaped by available resources, command doctrines, and geographic realities, set the stage for the engagements that would unfold once Allied ground forces began their movement inland toward the airfield complex. The initial inland movement toward the airfield complex began on May 28, 1944, as Allied forces advanced from the Bosnik beachhead. The 162nd Infantry Regiment led the eastern approach, while the 186th Infantry Regiment moved toward the Mokmer Ridge area. Engineers attempted to clear pathways through vegetation and coral shelves, which restricted maneuver. The terrain proved more complex than reconnaissance had suggested. Coral outcrops created natural choke points, where movement could only proceed in narrow formations, increasing vulnerability to fire from concealed positions. Japanese forces had established their first defensive lines not at the shoreline, but along these inland corridors. Machine guns and rifles were positioned within cave entrances that opened at elevated angles, making them difficult to target from below. Mortar teams operated from trenches behind ridgelines, withdrawing immediately into deeper caverns when counterfire began. These positions enabled defenders to apply controlled, intermittent fire aimed at slowing progress rather than attempting to halt the Allied advance entirely. Such tactics aligned with the broader Japanese objective of delaying the capture of the airfields for as long as possible. The first significant engagement occurred near the ridges south of Mokmer airfield. The terrain rose abruptly into limestone heights, known later in Allied reports as the West Caves and East Caves areas. As the 186th Infantry Regiment approached these formations, they encountered concentrated fire from Japanese positions embedded in the cliffs. Attempts to advance directly resulted in casualties among platoon-level units. Supporting fire from artillery and tanks could not immediately neutralize the cave networks, as the firing apertures were often small, angled to deflect incoming shells, and shielded by coral overhangs. To address this, the Allied command shifted to coordinated assault tactics. Infantry platoons advanced in staggered formations, while heavy machine guns established suppressive fire. Demolition teams equipped with explosives and flamethrowers were brought forward to target cave entrances. These operations required precision and often prolonged engagements, as individual cave positions had to be isolated and neutralized one at a time. The battle for control of the ridges did not resemble earlier open field engagements in New Guinea. Instead, it took the form of localized, repeated assaults on confined defensive pockets. Meanwhile, the 162nd Infantry Regiment advanced along the coastal route toward Mokmer. Although progress was initially faster, the appearance of Japanese resistance increased steadily. Patrols encountered defensive obstacles, including trenches, camouflage sniper nests, and concealed communications trails connecting rear positions to forward observation posts. The Japanese defenders demonstrated familiarity with the terrain and mobility along concealed interior pathways, enabling them to relocate frequently and re-engage from alternative angles. Naval bombardment and air support played roles in the early battles, but yielded limited effectiveness against subterranean defenses. Aircraft from the 5th Air Force conducted bombing runs aimed at suspected concentrations of defenders. However, the cave system shielded personnel and supplies from these strikes. Naval gunfire, though capable of displacing surface structures and vegetation, did not collapse most cave roofs due to the thickness of the coral formations. These conditions gave the defending forces a material advantage in terms of protection, despite their overall logistical constraints. The presence of armor provided the Allies with firepower and mobility advantages, yet movement of tanks was restricted by coral ridges and narrow inland pathways. Where terrain permitted, M4 Sherman tanks supported infantry by delivering high explosive rounds against defensive positions. In some cases, tanks were used to block cave entrances temporarily, preventing defenders from re-emerging until infantry units could advance to secure the area. However, the inability to maneuver armor freely limited the scale and continuity of such support. As the first week of the campaign progressed, differences in casualty patterns reflected the nature of the fighting. Allied losses resulted primarily from small arms fire, snipers, and localized ambushes. Japanese casualties occurred in smaller numbers across distributed defensive pockets, often during direct attacks on fortified cave complexes. The defensive strategy of depth and concealment allowed Japanese forces to maintain continuity of resistance despite losing forward positions. Civilian presence near the primary areas of fighting was minimal. However, small indigenous settlements located near supply trails and coastal lagoons experienced displacement. Some civilians relocated inland to avoid proximity to the battle areas, while others made contact with Allied patrols, offering geographic information that sometimes aided route selection or identified alternative approaches to elevated terrain. By early June, the Allies had secured positions within striking distance of Mokmer airfield, but had not yet established full control of the plateau. The initial engagements demonstrated that the capture of Biak would require prolonged, systematic reduction of defensive cave networks rather than the rapid advance originally planned. Japanese forces remained entrenched, supplied, and capable of reorganizing within the cave networks, indicating that the conflict on Biak was transitioning from an amphibious landing operation to a drawn-out attritional ground campaign shaped primarily by geography and defensive engineering. By mid-June 1944, the fighting on Biak entered a phase characterized by sustained escalation. Both Allied and Japanese commands adjusted their deployments and objectives as the operational situation evolved. The Allies sought to extend control from the beachhead toward the Mokmer airfield plateau, while the Japanese concentrated on delaying these movements through coordinated defense in depth. The terrain, supply constraints, and shifting tactical decisions shaped the nature of combat more than large-scale maneuver. The 186th Infantry Regiment pushed toward Mokmer airfield along the coastal plain. Engineers worked to clear obstacles and repair damaged ground to allow vehicles and artillery to move forward. On June 7th, elements of the regiment reached sections of Mokmer airfield's runway, marking the first physical contact with one of the operation's primary objectives. However, establishing sustained control proved difficult. Japanese forces, positioned on higher ground to the north and west, maintained lines of sight enabling observation and fire across the airfield grounds. Frequent bursts of machine gun and mortar fire disrupted engineering work and prevented the installation of necessary structures for aircraft to land safely. At the same time, the 162nd Infantry Regiment continued operations against the cave networks and defensive ridges inland. The series of engagements around what would later be designated the Ibdi Pocket, a concentrated network of Japanese positions and coral formations, became emblematic of the broader challenges faced by Allied troops. Clearing each cave required detailed reconnaissance, coordination among rifle squads, engineering support for demolitions, and often close-range use of flamethrowers. These operations were time-consuming and physically taxing. Progress was measured not in kilometers, but in meters gained over hours or days of fighting. The Japanese command, recognizing that the airfields could not be held indefinitely through static defense alone, introduced limited counterattacks aimed at disrupting Allied momentum. Small groups of infantry moved under cover of darkness to strike isolated positions, supply dumps, or engineering teams attempting to restore sections of the airfield. These actions did not aim to retake large territories, but rather to impose delays. The Japanese defenders relied on mobility along interior corridors within the cave systems, allowing them to appear unexpectedly and withdraw before Allied forces could organize pursuit. Signals intercepts and reconnaissance flights indicated attempts by Japanese naval forces to reinforce Biak. The Imperial Japanese Navy sought to deploy elements of the 32nd Infantry Regiment and additional support personnel from bases in the Celebes and western New Guinea regions. However, the increasing reach of Allied air and submarine patrols limited these movements. Several transport efforts were partially disrupted or forced to cancel. Nonetheless, some reinforcements did succeed in reaching the island via smaller vessels operating at night. These arrivals contributed to continued defensive strength inland, though they did not change the broader strategic balance. During this period, supply became a central concern for both sides. For the Allies, establishing a steady flow of ammunition, rations, medical supplies, and engineering materials from Hollandia to Biak required constant unloading operations at the beachhead. Inland movement of supplies depended on narrow trails and manually carried loads, as vehicle mobility remained constrained. The Japanese garrison faced declining access to food and medical supplies. The storage of essential resources in deep cave systems delayed shortages, but water availability became increasingly strained as the battle continued. Attempts to collect water from coastal sources exposed personnel to observation and fire. The terrain and climate continued to challenge both armies. High humidity, heat, and exposure to coral dust contributed to dehydration, eye irritation, and heat-related illness. Medical detachments recorded a notable proportion of non-combat casualties resulting from infection, exhaustion, and tropical disease. Allied malaria control measures, including repellents and netting, reduced rates of transmission, but did not eliminate the risk. Japanese medical personnel operated under more severe shortages, complicating treatment of wounds and illness. Morale on both sides reflected the conditions of the campaign. Allied soldiers reported frustration with the slow pace of progress and the difficulty of locating and neutralizing concealed defensive positions. Japanese defenders, while aware of the broader strategic disadvantage facing their forces elsewhere in the Pacific, maintained cohesion due to the protective advantages of fortified terrain and existing command directives emphasizing prolonged resistance. By late June, the Allies held partial control of Mokmer airfield and sections of the surrounding plateau, but Japanese forces continued to occupy elevated ground that prevented full operational use of the airstrip. Meanwhile, defensive positions near the Ibde Pocket and the ridges to the northwest remained intact. The situation had evolved into a prolonged standoff. The Allies continued to expand their hold over the plain, while the Japanese attempted to prolong their defense through continued use of subterranean networks. The ongoing engagements demonstrated that the battle for Biak would hinge not solely on securing territory, but on systematically reducing layered defensive systems across complex terrain. The campaign had entered a phase where both sides confronted challenges of endurance, adaptation, and resource allocation under increasingly demanding conditions. By late June and early July 1944, the fighting on Biak reached its most intense phase. The focus of operations shifted toward securing the high ground, dominating the Mokmer airfield, and neutralizing the remaining organized defensive centers. The largest of these concentrations was located along the ridges and cave complexes west of the airfield, an area later referred to in Allied operational records as the West Caves or the Mokmer Ridge defenses. Japanese forces retained command of these elevated positions, enabling continuous observation of the airfield plain and preventing the Allies from converting Mokmer into a functional operational base. The 41st Infantry Division repositioned its regiments to concentrate combat power on the ridge. The 186th Infantry Regiment was tasked with the primary assaults, while the 162nd and 163rd Regiments provided flank security and continued clearing operations in the Ibde Pocket. Supporting arms included artillery battalions employing 105mm howitzers, which targeted identified cave entrances and defensive corridors. However, the effectiveness of artillery bombardment remained limited by the depth and geometry of the limestone formations. Shells could damage exposed positions but frequently failed to penetrate deeper chambers. In an effort to accelerate progress, the Allied command increased the use of armor-supported infantry operations. Tanks equipped with 75mm guns moved along prepared pathways and were used to fire directly into cave openings at short range. These actions were coordinated with rifle platoons and demolitions teams, who advanced under covering fire to place explosive charges at cave mouths. Flamethrower operators, often supported by 2- or 3-man security teams, applied direct flame to confined entrances to disrupt defensive fire. Such tactics required close contact and resulted in elevated casualty rates among specialized assault teams. Japanese defensive formations during this period maintained organized resistance. Units from the 222nd Infantry Regiment, supported by naval ground detachments, rotated positions between forward firing points and deeper interior shelters. Command within the cave systems relied on runners and established internal pathways, allowing orders to reach dispersed defensive elements despite disruptions to surface movement. Food and ammunition stocks remained sufficient for ongoing combat, though water shortages persisted and increasingly affected the endurance of personnel stationed in exposed positions. The Japanese High Command attempted to alter the course of the battle through external reinforcement. In early June, the Imperial Japanese Navy organized a reinforcement attempt, known in Allied intelligence summaries as the Khan Force Movement. This plan involved deploying destroyers to transport additional troops to Biak under cover of darkness. The operation resulted in limited success. Some reinforcement parties reached the island, but Allied air surveillance and naval interdiction disrupted further landings. Several destroyers were forced to withdraw, and air attacks on supporting vessels increased the risk of continued attempts. These reinforcement efforts provided incremental manpower, but did not change the broader balance of the campaign. The terrain continued to shape combat at every stage. Coral ridges forced infantry into narrow avenues of approach, where Japanese defenders could direct fire from concealed elevations. Attempts to bypass defensive nodes often required time-consuming reconnaissance to locate alternate routes through vegetation and uneven ground. The Allies expanded the use of small unit patrols to identify weak points and map cave entrances. night operations were introduced to minimize exposure to observation. However, limited visibility and unfamiliar terrain increased the risk of disorientation and accidental separation among advancing units. As the battle intensified, air operations continued to play a supporting role. Aircraft from the 5th Air Force conducted periodic strikes on suspected defensive clusters and supply trails north of the ridge. These attacks disrupted some Japanese movement, but had minimal effect on fortified cave positions. Airborne resupply operations remained limited, as Mokmer airfield could not yet support sustained aircraft landings. Meanwhile, naval gunfire support shifted to intermittent bombardment, coordinated with requests from forward observers positioned along the ridge's lower slopes. Casualty numbers reflected the attrition-based nature of the campaign. Allied reports recorded losses among rifle companies engaged in repeated close-range assaults, particularly within confined cave approaches. Japanese losses were distributed across numerous small defensive nodes, with positions often reoccupied or reconfigured after temporary withdrawal. Medical support on both sides was strained. Allied medical units worked continuously to treat wounds and prevent infection. Japanese personnel faced limited access to surgical treatment and declining supplies of disinfectants and bandages, affecting recovery prospects for injured defenders. By mid-July, the Allies secured control of the majority of the ridgeline overlooking Mokmer airfield. The remaining Japanese forces withdrew deeper into the interior cave systems, reducing their ability to conduct observation and direct fire onto the airfield. This shift permitted engineering units to resume repair and expansion of the runway. Heavy equipment was brought forward under escort, and work crews began clearing debris, leveling surfaces, and installing temporary facilities. The airfield was not yet fully operational, but forward progress indicated that the strategic objective of establishing a functional airbase was approaching feasibility. The peak of the campaign thus marked the transition from contested ground to conditional Allied control of key terrain. However, resistance did not end with the loss of the ridges. The Japanese garrison, though diminished in mobility and supply, retained the capacity to conduct localized counterattacks and prolonged defensive actions within remaining cave systems. The battle would continue, though now under conditions increasingly unfavorable to the defenders as the Allies consolidated their position across the airfield plain. The morning of February 18, 1944, arrived under the heavy roar of aircraft engines. The air over Truk Lagoon was once again thick with smoke, and those still alive on the islands could only guess whether this was the fading haze of yesterday's devastation, or the beginning of a new assault. In reality, it marked the second day of Operation Hailstone. The American task force had no intention of allowing the enemy time to recover. On the decks of the carriers, crews worked without pause. Mechanics replaced engines, inspected landing gear, hauled bombs and torpedoes along steel rails beneath the wings of waiting planes. Pilots, exhausted yet unwavering in their focus, reviewed new target assignments. They knew that trucks still held fuel depots, ammunition warehouses, command centers, and ships tucked into hidden coves. Their mission was not yet complete. Aboard USS Indianapolis, Admiral Spruance's flagship, the atmosphere was taut and silent, the silence of controlled tension. Radio intercepts indicated that Japanese command was attempting to evacuate high-ranking personnel and critical documents by air. Such transports had to be intercepted, swiftly and decisively. Squadrons of American fighters received orders to take to the skies and patrol every likely route of escape. Meanwhile, deep within the fortified command bunker on Eaton Island, Japanese officers gathered for an emergency council. The room was stifling, not only from the tropical heat, but from the weight of realization. Communication lines flickered and failed. Radio coordination was fragmentary at best. Reports made it clear that the loss of naval strength was catastrophic. Now the question was whether they could preserve even a fragment of their air power or defensive infrastructure. For the Americans, the objective had shifted. It was no longer merely the destruction of ships. It was the systematic dismantling of Truk as a functioning military stronghold, ensuring it would never again serve as the Gibraltar of the Pacific. The second day of the attack would seal that fate. The fighting on Biak entered a decisive phase in late June 1944, when both sides recognized that their earlier expectations had not been met. The island, originally anticipated by Allied planners to be secured within a matter of days, had instead become the site of prolonged combat, shaped by cave networks, fortified ridges, and defensive positions designed to absorb and outlast conventional assaults. For the Allied command, the situation required a shift from rapid maneuver to systematic reduction. For the Japanese defenders, it required maintaining cohesion while confronting severe shortages of water, ammunition, and medical supplies. American forces, under the command structure directed by General Robert L. Eichelberger and subordinate division and regimental leadership, adjusted their tactics to meet the demands of the terrain. Infantry units operated in smaller, coordinated groups that combined maneuver with sustained fire support from mortars, field artillery, and tanks. Engineers played a central role, clearing obstacles, blasting cave entrances, and marking safe movement routes. Air support from nearby Allied airfields provided reconnaissance and close support strikes, though the dense vegetation and limestone ridges often limited visibility and reduced the effectiveness of airborne operations. On the Japanese side, the forces under Colonel Naoyuki Kuzume continued to rely on defensive tactics that emphasized concealment and surprise. Instead of massed counterattacks, which had produced heavy losses earlier, the defenders transitioned to an approach that utilized carefully selected firing points, short bursts of rifle and machine gun fire, and rapid withdrawal into secondary positions. This pattern allowed them to slow the Allied advance despite their inferior numbers and limited reinforcement options. Command communications were increasingly dependent on runners and improvised signal points, as radio equipment had been damaged or exhausted of power. The Americans' progress toward key strategic locations, particularly the 3 airfields along Biak's southern plateau, was steady but costly. Each forward movement required securing high ground, clearing cave systems, and establishing supply corridors for food, ammunition, and medical evacuation. Casualty evacuation required stretcher teams to navigate steep, uneven terrain under irregular sniper fire and the threat of mortar strikes launched from concealed positions. Water scarcity affected both sides, though Japanese troops experienced more acute shortages due to disrupted supply lines and control of wells and reservoirs by advancing American forces. The presence of armored units such as M4 Sherman tanks provided the Americans with a significant advantage in firepower. However, the tanks' mobility was limited by sharp ridges, narrow jungle paths, and prepared anti-tank ambush points. Japanese anti-tank teams employed magnetic mines, satchel charges, and concealed artillery to disable or destroy individual vehicles. In several engagements, tanks had to be withdrawn to avoid operating without reliable infantry support in narrow defiles where Japanese defenders could strike from elevated and concealed positions. Meanwhile, the air campaign over the region intensified as Allied air units sought to prevent Japanese reinforcement by sea. Aircraft from nearby Allied bases targeted Japanese barges and transport vessels attempting to approach the island under cover of night or coastal overhangs. Despite these interdiction measures, some small groups of Japanese reinforcements managed to reach Biak's beaches or remote inlets, though their arrival did not significantly alter the strategic balance given the scale of depletion within Kuzume's original force. Morale evolved differently on each side. Among American units, fatigue was widespread, particularly as combat extended beyond initial estimates and conditions proved harsher than anticipated. Medical officers reported increasing rates of heat-related illness, dehydration, and tropical infections. Nonetheless, reinforcement rotations and the gradual capture of critical terrain contributed to a sense of progress. For Japanese defenders, morale fluctuated between determined resistance and the growing awareness that relief was unlikely. The decision to adopt a final defensive posture in the cave systems had not been intended as a static last stand, but increasingly came to function as one due to the isolation imposed by Allied control of land and sea routes. By late June, the strategic picture began to shift. The Americans gained firm control over Mokmer airfield, the most significant of Biak's airstrips, and initiated repair operations to prepare it for Allied aircraft. Repair crews worked under protective screens and patrols, clearing debris and reconstructing runway surfaces damaged by artillery and explosives. The ability to operate fighters and medium bombers from Biak would enable the Allies to expand their operational reach toward western New Guinea and the surrounding archipelagos, altering the broader balance of air power in the region. For Japanese command on Biak, the situation now hinged not on holding the island outright, but on prolonging resistance to complicate Allied timetables. Every additional day of defense had potential implications for operations elsewhere along the New Guinea-Philippines axis. The defenders shifted further into interior positions, where caves, galleries, and natural rock formations allowed them to continue resisting at lower troop densities. As the Americans secured more open terrain around the airfields, the battle transitioned into a phase defined by attrition within confined and difficult landscapes. This was the turning stage in which both sides recognized that the course of the campaign, though not yet concluded, had decisively changed. The Americans had achieved access to the key operational objective, while the Japanese retained the capability to impose continued effort and cost upon the advancing forces. The implications of this balance would shape the final phase of the battle, where tactical endurance and the management of dwindling resources came to outweigh maneuver and large-scale field engagements. As July 1944 progressed, the final phase of the fighting on Biak became defined by containment rather than maneuver. The American command had secured the primary airfields and most of the coastal plain, enabling further air operations across western New Guinea and toward the Philippines. The Japanese forces remaining on the island, now significantly reduced in number, withdrew into the interior ridge systems where caves, tunnels, and narrow gorges provided strong natural defenses. These positions allowed them to continue resisting, though they no longer held the ability to alter the strategic outcome of the campaign. The Japanese command structure on Biak, once centralized under Colonel Naoyuki Kuzume, became increasingly fragmented as the remaining units were separated by terrain and the steady advance of American patrols. Supplies of ammunition, food, and medical materials were nearly exhausted. Some units operated with only a small number of functioning rifles, relying on cached stores of grenades or improvised explosive devices. Water sources were among the most contested assets. Wells and streams that remained accessible were often located in exposed areas, requiring movement under the risk of observation and fire. The scarcity of clean water contributed to rising incidents of disease, including dysentery and malaria, further reducing combat effectiveness. American forces adjusted their approach to focus on systematic reduction of the remaining resistance pockets. Infantry patrols moved cautiously along established ridgelines, supported by artillery positioned to target cave mouths and natural rock shelters. Engineers continued using demolition charges to seal or neutralize cave entrances. In some instances, loudspeakers were used to broadcast calls for surrender, though these efforts resulted in limited responses. The Japanese defensive doctrine emphasized continued resistance regardless of circumstance, and many personnel expressed the expectation that withdrawal or surrender was not possible. By mid-July, the majority of organized Japanese defensive positions had been disrupted. Colonel Kuzume was reported to have directed his remaining staff to destroy documents and equipment that could be of value to Allied intelligence. Contemporary accounts indicate that he took measures to avoid capture, in accordance with prevailing military expectations within the Japanese command system. His death symbolized the dissolution of centralized resistance on Biak, though individual defensive groups continued to operate in isolated areas. For the Americans, the transition from large-scale combat to localized clearing actions did not eliminate operational challenges. Heat, humidity, and dense vegetation continued to hinder mobility. Evacuation of the wounded and the transport of supplies along rugged interior paths required coordinated logistical planning. Medical teams remained occupied with treating both combat injuries and tropical illnesses, which affected personnel even after major combat had decreased. Engineers continued expanding and improving the captured airfields, enabling the arrival of additional aircraft that extended the Allied operational radius deeper into territories still under Japanese control. Civilians living on Biak and neighboring islands experienced the effects of displacement and disrupted subsistence systems. Some communities had relocated away from coastal areas during earlier stages of the campaign. As the island came under American control, military authorities organized distribution of food and medical supplies and established temporary camps in accessible areas. The challenges of communication across linguistic and cultural boundaries required reliance on local intermediaries familiar with both indigenous and military structures of authority. These interactions reflected the broader complexity of Allied administration across the Pacific region, where strategic priorities intersected with the needs of local populations. With the major objectives on Biak achieved, Allied command shifted attention to subsequent operations along the New Guinea coast and toward the Philippine archipelago. The capture and restoration of the airfields on Biak contributed to the acceleration of these plans. Aircraft deployed from Biak participated in reconnaissance and bombing missions that supported landings on nearby islands and along key coastal routes. The island's role as a forward operating base signaled the changing geographic balance of control in the region. For the Japanese military command and the broader theater, the loss of Biak and its airfields represented a significant strategic setback. The capacity to maintain aerial supply and reinforcement routes across western New Guinea had already been challenged by Allied air and naval interdiction. The loss of Biak further reduced the feasibility of coordinated defensive operations. Remaining Japanese units in the region attempted to adapt through dispersal and concealment, though the broader logistical situation continued to deteriorate as Allied forces advanced. By August 1944, organized combat on Biak had effectively concluded, though small groups of Japanese troops continued to operate in remote areas for months afterward, sometimes avoiding detection or attempting to subsist on limited resources. American forces shifted responsibility for ongoing clearance and local security to smaller detachments while continuing to maintain and expand the airbase infrastructure. The end of major operations on Biak marked the close of a campaign defined not by a rapid territorial movement, but by sustained combat in an environment shaped by geology, climate, and defensive planning. For the participants on both sides, the withdrawal from large-scale battle brought a period of reflection shaped by conditions of fatigue, loss, and the unaltered demands of the broader conflict that continued beyond the island's shores. In the months and years following the Battle of Biak, the island's significance within the broader context of the Pacific War became increasingly evident. The capture and operational use of the airfields on Biak contributed directly to the Allied capacity to conduct sustained aerial missions across western New Guinea, the Moluccas, and eventually toward Mindanao and Luzon. From these runways, medium and heavy bombers took part in reconnaissance flights, interdiction missions, and preparatory strikes that shaped the conditions for subsequent amphibious operations. The island thus formed part of a broader network of forward bases that facilitated the extension of Allied air superiority and logistical reach across the region. For the Japanese military, the loss of Biak reflected the gradual erosion of strategic depth across the Southwest Pacific. The defensive posture designed to delay Allied progress had initially relied on strong points coordinated across the archipelago, supported by naval and air mobility. However, the reduction of Truk as a forward naval bastion, the increasing challenges of resupply under Allied air pressure, and the loss of intermediate airfields, including those on Biak, limited the feasibility of coordinated counteroffensives. The campaign demonstrated the difficulty of relying on isolated, static defensive positions when broader logistical and command networks were under persistent strain. Within military analysis, the battle on Biak is often referenced for its demonstration of terrain-adapted defensive methods. The Japanese use of natural limestone cave systems, constructed galleries, and concealed artillery positions illustrated the potential of integrated subterranean defenses to delay a materially superior opponent. For Allied planners and infantry commands, the campaign contributed to the development and refinement of tactics for cave reduction, coordinated infantry engineer tank operations, controlled use of demolitions, and medical evacuation under tropical conditions. These methods would prove relevant in subsequent campaigns in the Philippines and throughout islands where similar geological conditions existed. For the soldiers who took part in the campaign, the legacy of Biak was shaped by physical and psychological demands that extended beyond the immediate combat engagements. Heat, dehydration, difficult supply lines, and exposure to disease influenced the daily experience of military operations. Medical records and post-campaign reports noted sustained rates of illness related to tropical climate, while personal accounts described extended periods of close-quarter combat, characterized by limited visibility and constant uncertainty regarding concealed threats. These conditions shaped the broader understanding of operational endurance in the Pacific theater. The civilian population of Biak and neighboring islands experienced the war as disruption to established patterns of settlement, subsistence, and inter-island exchange. Some communities were displaced during the fighting and later needed to rebuild agricultural plots, fishing networks, and communal structures. Post-war administration under Allied control included efforts to restore local governance and social networks, though the pace and scope of recovery varied among regions and communities. The long-term effects included alterations to trade networks, infrastructure development linked to the airfields, and shifts in local political organization influenced by the broader decolonization processes that unfolded after the war. In historical scholarship, the Battle of Biak is viewed not as an isolated event, but as one link within the sequential progression of operations that marked the Allied return across the Pacific. Its significance lies in the strategic function of securing air bases needed to support the advance toward the Philippine Islands, as well as in the demonstration of defensive resilience by Japanese forces operating with diminishing resources. The campaign also contributes to broader discussions regarding the relationship between planning expectations and operational realities, as the extended duration of the battle contrasted with early projections of a brief engagement. In commemoration and memory, Biak holds different meanings across national narratives. American records emphasize the island's role in operational planning and the challenges of combat in restrictive terrain. Japanese accounts often focus on the determination of the garrison and the constraints imposed by the broader strategic situation. Local memory reflects the impact on communities, landscapes, and post-war reconstruction. The combination of these perspectives forms a multifaceted historical legacy shaped by military, cultural, and human dimensions. Today, remnants of wartime installations, cave sites, airfields, and memorials remain on Biak, integrated into both historical research and local heritage. The island stands as a place where strategic planning, environmental conditions, and human endurance intersected during a critical phase of the Pacific War. The legacy of the campaign continues to be examined not only through military documentation and analysis, but also through the lived experiences of those who inhabited and traversed the island during and after the conflict.